Okay, good morning. We will get started. It's about 3 minutes after 11:30. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. We have some great special guests today who will be speaking on this topic. So I'm proud to introduce Cynthia Schneidman-Miller, who is a senior consultant with Blue Cirrus Consulting. She has over 25 years of telehealth experience. And if you've been in telehealth for any length of time, you know that's a long time, and Cynthia has been integral in moving the industry forward. Her experience includes being the administrative director for telehealth at a large health system on that other coast, on the West Coast. She has successfully written and served as project director for HRSA, USDA, and ARC telehealth grants. So lots of experience there in terms of understanding the grants, et cetera. And then Josh Brazil, who is also here with us. We're happy to have Josh here again with all of his rural experience. He is the CIO for the Rural Health Network of Oklahoma. Josh's experience includes 18 years of rural public service leadership and 20 years in information technology and information systems. Mr. Brazil has been involved in infrastructure planning and implementation projects ranging from the Department of Justice, sponsored by NCA TRAC, Abused and Exploited Children's Data System, to multiple HRSA, FCC, and USDA telemedicine grants. In addition to his CIO duties at the Rural Health Network of Oklahoma, he currently serves on the board of directors for the Telehealth Alliance of Oklahoma and Remote Area Medical of Oklahoma. So we are proud to have both of you here today. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
I'm going to advance this slide, and we will see the graphic that we have had related to this presentation, because I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about why we decided to do this. First of all, I think what you'll learn from today is not only some tips on how to successfully complete a grant, but also why you might go after a grant, why you might not go after a grant, and also the full continuum, so more of a holistic look at it. So we liked this idea of vacation, and you've got a grant that's out, now it's time to pack. And we said when you're going out on a vacation, sometimes there's a lot of different variables to think about. Where are you going to go? What are you going to pack? What are you going to do when you get there? So we kind of wove that through the presentation today. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Cynthia so that they can start the presentation, but that's kind of our purpose today. And I don't know, Cynthia and Josh, if you have anything you want to add to that in terms of our explanation of why we decided to do this webinar.
No, I think that was a good explanation with parallels there. And from the start, even information gathering for this, that was kind of the idea we had. So it should match up pretty well and relate for folks.
Good, good. All right, well, I'm going to advance the slide and get this moving. Oops, wrong way. There we go. There's all of our pictures. What I'll do for the most part is stay behind the scenes and just ask a couple questions as I need to, but Josh and Cynthia will take it from here. Okay, Josh and Cynthia.
Okay, so the first thing, most important part, and really day to day for me when I'm looking at funding opportunities for our organization, you have to know where you're going. You've got to pick that vacation. So it requires some thought and purpose. There are a lot of misconceptions about grant funding in general. So I really like the graphic there. I hope they brought that in because I always mention the cardboard check, and that's kind of maybe a little backhanded of me when we're talking about grant projects, but you can't cash that check. The bank will laugh at you if you show up with it. It's a publicity representation, and it's not easy money without strings attached. There's a lot that goes with it. So I've held a lot of those and been photographed doing that, unfortunately, but it's really a promise and a goal for your project. So your big check has a project budget on it. In most cases, especially the federal grants, they're not going to send you that amount of money at any point. You're going to do all the work, pay your staff, buy your things, and then put in claims to their payment management system to get all or some of that back. When you're planning, it's very important to understand what you need, whether it's technology or infrastructure, operating costs. And when you're making that determination, a lot of factors are going into it as well, like what these funders will fund, because that may not align with what you need. So if the infrastructure is your need, HRSA may not be the funder that builds out the networks and make sure you have the bandwidth to do what you need to there. You may have to go through FCC or private funds. I think other misconceptions in general, folks look at a grant application and think that makes a lot of sense, and that's what we already do. So we're the obvious candidate. So I just need to go through the motions and submit something here, and will definitely be funded, which is almost never the case. You do have to qualify, but you have to do everything exactly the way they want, and it needs to line up with what they fund and what can happen. I think we could move to alignment if we've got that next.
Sure. I was gonna say,
Sorry.
Josh, that I think it is really important that what you just said, that you're not just going to get money poured sort of on top of you. And I think sometimes when people are thinking about the grants and they think about that they're just going to suddenly get a check for $500,000 or more. So it's an important point.
Oh, absolutely. And it's an entire process. If you're a small organization, and I've been in small organizations with large grants before, you need capital to do that. The folks that you're hiring, they're going to want to be paid before the 60 days that it takes to do a money drawdown and get that back. So yeah, that's some important planning. I appreciate you bringing that up, Michelle. I asked to move to the next one because it started going with the misconceptions and segued with what I was talking about there. But when you're making those decisions, very important thing to do is make sure you've got alignment in your project. So you've thought about what you're going to do, you've planned it. You need to make sure that your organization and your mission is aligned with what you're proposing to do, and that you are asking or you're reaching out for funding or a project partnership with an organization who funds things in that area and is a likely fit for you. I can go on grants.gov this morning, representing our nonprofit, and they make matches. There's a interesting search feature there, but 99% of those would never make sense for a rural health organization. A lot of people, when they're new to the grant writing world, they want to chase money and go after everything that's out there, and you really can't. You'll just spin your wheels and waste your time, and it's not really good for your organization or the funder.
Good point.
So general telehealth tip along these lines, you have to define the kind of technology you need, or the kind of assistance, the kind of funding you need. You need to know exactly how and where it will be used, the type of setting, rural or urban, because that's going to be important for your project and for your funder, and may or may not make your project ineligible for the funding. So you can't go with the general idea and think we want to do telemedicine, that means we buy a large contract from a vendor and have 20 carts delivered. Then once we have the carts, telemedicine happens, because you have to know where all of those are going to be, where they fall in the rural or urban census tracts, exactly how they're going to be used, and how you're going to collect data and metrics, and a number of others.
Super important point, right? So, and I know, Cynthia, you have probably some thoughts on this as well, but I think what's really important here that I wanted to highlight is this idea of creating what this program is going to be. So you really can't go out and say, we're just going to order 100 carts, or we're just going to order 200, cameras and microphones. You really need to be able to design the program and the technology as a part of that program. And that's what is a key in looking at these grants when they're evaluating them and approving them. If you've got a good plan, then the grantees, or the grantors, I should say, are more confident that you will actually be able to pull it off, and therefore more likely to give you that money. So I don't know, what do you have to add to that, Cynthia?
No, you need to have that, because that is part of the long range plan, is that you know what you're going to use the money for. Funders want it's an investment in you, when they give you money, and they want to make sure that they selected well, and that you are focused on how it's going to be used. Many years ago, it was, as you said, they would just give you money for 25 carts or whatever, and then you figure out how you're going to do it, what you're going to do with it. Well, those days are long gone. You have to really plan the whole, not just the equipment, but to focus on the problem that you're going to solve. And I think that is one thing that people kind of overlook sometimes, that's part of the decision process, right? We can't get a rheumatologist to our facility, and it's 200 miles away to the closest one that will serve our Medicare or Medicaid population. But we can solve that problem, because right now they're not getting care. But if we had telehealth in this one clinic or these two clinics, then we can deliver that service locally. And you're focusing where you need to focus, not on the technology, but on the problem.
Good point. Good point.
So
now we're gonna
planning
plan
ahead and
Go
getting
ahead.
what you need for the journey is a lot of planning is done before that grant ever comes out. I think that's what Josh was kind of alluding to. You need to know where you're going. You need to know what your gaps are. And so one of the things that you have to do, next slide, please. One of the things you have to do is make a budget, which some people just cringe when you tell them that, but it is very true. You need to do it. And one of the cautions is make it as detailed as you can, and make it by site. I've seen grants where you have to have it 4 or 5 different ways. You may have to have it by county. You may have to have it by congressional district. You may have to have it by site. And then they want the overall grant portion. Plus they want maybe the total program. So again, as Josh mentioned, include not only what you're going to ask grant funds, but the whole thing. The more they can see that you've got skin in the game, the more and that you planned it, the more likely they are to fund you. And then another thing that I'm seeing a lot is long-term sustainability. Again, when we started this 25 years ago, that really wasn't an issue. They were looking more at what is telehealth useful for, what works with it. Well, we've gone past that stage, and now we're saying we have, as I mentioned, a problem that needs solved, and how after the grant goes away, and we all know those horror stories of people write grants, and then after they do great and wonderful things during the grant, and then the grant ends and they end the program. They want to know how you're going to continue it afterwards. Again, this is an investment. They want their money used wisely and to the best long-term positive impact. And again, that's kind of what Josh mentioned before. When you do this whole budget and look at it, you kind of say, even if we get that funding for the technology, say, is it going to be worth the effort? And it's not just the effort after you get the grant. It's the effort before you get the grant, because it is a rule of thumb. It takes 100 hours to write a federal grant. Now, it doesn't mean one person has to do it all, but you have to consider that, is it worth 100 hours of our time to get a grant that maybe they're only going to give 10 in the whole United States? Or do you look at smaller foundations that might serve you in your region, or even grants? There's one that just came out from the USDA. They're going to have $500 million that they have to commit, and the highest amount you can get is $1 million. So there's at least 500 people are going to get funded. Well, now you kind of say, maybe it is worth the effort. Maybe I'm more likely to be funded, and so then you can work for that. So that's kind of part of the detailed budget. Understand the SF 424. You can do that long before you apply for any federal grant. You need to know it's a little different, makes total sense to them, but they do want things a little differently. It's usually future years that they want you to show in the columns, and then how much you're going to get, what you ask for the initial year. And then there's another one that it was a 5-year grant that we applied for. And the column, there's only 4 years columns. So you had then to find out where you're going to put that other, how you're going to deal with that. So always familiarize yourself with and read the instructions. I will compliment the federal government on this, and that they have a lot better description and instructions than they used to for this. I think they had a lot of suggestions that maybe they needed to be a little more instructive, and it has greatly improved. Pre-plan with any potential partners. Don't let the grant go out and say, you know what, this would be great if we have this clinic or that Indian Health Service or the food bank, maybe even if it's that type of grant. Start ahead talking to people, saying, we know that there's going to be grant money coming. Here is what we are looking at. Would you like to participate? Then when you need to ask them for that letter that says, yes, we will participate, yes, we will match a certain amount of money, it's much quicker turnaround on that. And they know what's going down the pike, and they understand. And I might also say some of your potential partners, maybe even such as clinics or providers within your own system. And, they keep saying, well, we know there's some grants or, but no one explained it to us. You want to make sure up front they're understanding what is going on and what's going to be asked of them. And then finally, know your organization's process for grant applications. They can differ greatly. Sometimes one thing, for example, is like universities, a lot of times they want it 2 weeks ahead, everything completely done. All the letters you need, all the forms, everything completely done to them 2 weeks before the end, because that allows them time to have legal review. Maybe the person is really busy that is the authorized signator. And so you need to allow that time. Who do you actually submit the grant to? Who actually has the authority? Next. And then finally, make sure, this is a telehealth tip, make sure you know all the hidden costs. And a classic example is the stethoscope may cost $350, and that's all you know about. But maybe there's a software subscription that is a yearly cost to you to use that. And by the way, fewer and fewer grants are paying for that software subscription. So then you need to figure that in your budget as on that part of that whole sustainability component. Is that something that you can sustain? And some of those software subscriptions are reasonable, and some are extremely high. So if that's the case, you may even consider a different type of stethoscope that may be costless to use, for example. So make sure you know warranties, service level agreements, training, and what does training, what is included in the training? Is it just remote training? Are they on-site training? Do they train a certain amount and not others? All that stuff. And you can get all that information before the grant RFP ever comes out. And trust me, when that RFP comes out, it's a flurry of activity, and you want as little to have to do as possible when the grant comes out. Josh, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Cynthia. This idea of including all of these additional costs that are out there. And I'm thinking about something like, sorry, and I know my pointer comes up on the screen when I'm moving it around, so I apologize for that. But one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about training, this is so important because often they'll say, well, yes, we include training, but it's train the trainer training. So you are just getting a couple of people in your organization trained, then you're responsible for training them. So you need to include the cost of your internal staff as part of that. Sometimes people forget that cost, right? They think, oh, well, we're just being paid, we're part of the organization, but there's an additional cost associated with that because you're not focused on your day-to-day job or you're not focused on a different project.
There is, and I wanted to add all the other logistics that surround that. So if you receive this project, you're expected to deliver on what you said you would do. So there are the warranties, there are the subscriptions. You also have to make sure you can fund the mileage to send people out and do the things that are hands-on that need to be, and that you can support a telemed encounter over the internet connection at these endpoint sites, that their infrastructure will handle that. And if not, you need a plan because that can cost a lot more than the whole project. It's it can get deep quickly.
As usual, great tip there, Josh.
So continuing with planning ahead, one thing that people don't realize is a lot of times what we are requested are not just the project plan, but maybe the organization's articles of incorporation or not-for-profit status, mission statements. It may be, I'm seeing more things like bylaws, evidence of good standing, articles of incorporation, ability to do business with the federal government. That could be a tricky one. Can your organization prove that they can? So again, plan ahead, get all that. If you have a foundation, that makes it easier because usually they have all that information, but sometimes even they don't. So you need to check with them just to be sure they have all that stuff. So that when you need it to grab it to include in an application, that it's there, electronic copy, obviously. And then if you're a federal grant, and again, we keep leaning towards federal grants, a lot of this goes across the board. Even if you're going to a private foundation, they ask for a lot more information than they used to. But for the federal government, the SANS.gov registration is required for most federal grants. I won't say all, but most of them. And it takes a process. It takes a few weeks to get this all done. You have to make sure you have a DUNS number, and then you submit things, and you have authorized signatures. And so there's some setting up of that you need to do. Again, if you have a foundation, that's very helpful. But if you're a smaller organization, it's probably you. So you need to make sure that's done. And then know your administrative costs. I've seen administrative costs at some universities. They've negotiated with the federal government as high as 55%. So if you get let's say $100,000 grant, you only have 45% of that $100,000 grant that can be used for the actual grant itself. And again, when you're doing your budget, keep that in mind, because 55% goes to indirect costs in this scenario to the organization to keep the lights on. As a general rule, you plan 10 to 15% of indirect costs is allowed. And again, don't forget that's a nice little perk. But again, it cuts into your actual program function, budget. And so kind of keep that. So know very much, especially if you're a larger organization, what has been negotiated with the federal government for that.
So Cynthia, can I ask a question about that?
Uh-huh.
So if you have 10 to 15% allowable, let's just do round numbers and we'll do 10%. If you have $100,000 grant that you're going for, can you say that 10% of that is administrative cost, or can you do $110,000 because you've got an administrative cost of $10,000? I see.
No,
which one's the right one?
If you're awarded $100,000, and you've negotiated, you put included in it that 10% of that is going to indirect costs, then you still get 100,000. 10% goes to administrative, the remaining 90,000 goes to the program.
Okay, good. So then my assumption, and again, this is my secondary question, so you tell me if I'm right. So that means that when I'm doing the reporting on the other end of it, to say this is where my costs were, I am able to count up to 10% of that essentially as administrative cost.
Mhm.
Is that an accurate statement? I'm legitimately asking because I don't
Yes.
know.
Yes, it is, and it's built in to the whole budgeting process. So the indirect rate even is included in the 424 and the plan you make in the beginning. So if you've negotiated, you'll have effectively a contract with the government that's an indirect cost rate agreement, or they can specify in the application. If they don't, though, the de minimis and the normally accepted rate is 10, and it's built into every part, 424, your budget, the whole process.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And as he said, the 10% sort of normal, but some will specify you can put up to 15 or 20% for indirect cost. And some even say, I don't care what your organization has negotiated with the federal government, we're only going to pay 10%. So again,
Interesting.
it's as we kind of allude to, once the grant RFP comes out, read it carefully, highlight, make notes so that you don't submit a grant proposal with the wrong numbers in it that they won't pay. It just, you want your best foot forward. Okay, next. So one of the things that we're seeing more often is a telecommunications plan, particularly with the USDA grants, distance learning telehealth grants. And if you want to know what needs to be included, I would go to old applications for that particular grant, because it outlines exactly what they want to see. Part of it is a schematic. Part of it, they like good pictures. And part of it is narrative. And we kind of talk about this in other hats as well. Describe, discuss, make sure you make it very clear. In the case of the USDA, they may have no clue about network configuration. You need to make it very clear. And so if you have this telecommunications plan prepared, even if it's a year old, then you just go to your IT department, or to Josh in his case, and you say, is this still correct? And that's a lot easier to get them to do it, because they can take, that's not high on their priority, your IT department. They have other things to do. They have, systems that, maybe they're updating or they're going down, or, just the day-to-day sort of taxing on their time. And this is very, very important, this telecommunications plan. So that's one thing you can have done ahead before the grant ever comes out. Again, remember, when the grant comes out, you have a limited time to write it. Then the other thing is, what if you don't have a lot of telehealth experience, or maybe none at all at this point? They still, a lot of times, will, depending on the grant, they'll still fund you if you tell them how you are going to address this weakness. And it may be hiring a consultant to assist with the project setup, or some of the things like that, so that they know that you've planned ahead for that and have taken that in consideration. So have that verbiage ready. Optimal, have the telecommunications plan prepared. Okay, next.
Who can help? I'm probably a subject matter expert here, because I will ask anyone for anything, and I don't mind looking silly to do it. So I've done plenty of these. There are plenty of sources, not just for planning, writing, but when you're awarded the grant, there are just a huge assortment of resources to help you execute that, to plan. This page, we've got general search and information on the front end. So grants.gov that we mentioned a couple of times earlier is a good, constantly updated repository of everything the federal government is granting for, or the most complete one I know. Maybe there are programs they don't put there, but it seems to be a very complete list. Then the Foundation Center, candid.org. So Foundation Center and Grant Watch, they combined. And have I got that right, Cynthia, that now Candid is the sole source and it's a subscription-based service?
They have some free online services, but by and large, it's subscription. And as we note there, what I always did is that most organizations don't have the money just to randomly subscribe to this. So what they did that has been wonderful is they have universities usually that do buy it because they need it for their own, but they also make it available for the public as a service. And so you can go there and utilize their search engines, which are really nice for foundations, especially the smaller ones, like we mentioned earlier, private foundations, wonderful search engine on exactly what they'll fund and how much they give and information about the grant itself.
And that's a helpful subscription that we use. And in our case, all of our small providers pooling their resources. So I'm glad that we have that one. It's very useful. And the foundations and the foundation funding, that is deep and different. And I know Cynthia mentioned earlier, we're leaning more toward federal because it's a set and steady and very rural driven application set. So the foundations are more leaning that way, but they can award their money how they would like to. So we're giving too much information because some won't require all of that. Then Grant Watch, the state health departments, GuideStar has always been pretty useful going back to alignment. So GuideStar can tell you when, how, and what these organizations have funded so that you know, I mean, you don't want to just look at a title from a foundation that's usually governed by a board who have their core issues that they care about. Just the title really doesn't get you to that knowledge point of, is this something, or is this a group that's going to fund what we're working on in our organization? GuideStar helps a lot there. The telehealth resource centers, I hope everyone on the call is familiar with the groups around the country. The federally funded telehealth resource center, they are good folks divided up over regions and a great resource. I'd bug at least 3 different regional telehealth resource centers all the time because they're a great resource and generally full of very nice folks.
And most of their services are free.
Absolutely. And I love free.
Who doesn't love free? Can I ask you something, Josh? I know you get a couple more to talk about, but
Sure.
State Department of Health, that's like a big place when I think about, okay, I'm going to go to my State Department of Health, especially now where the State Departments of Health websites are really covered over with COVID and things like that. Where do you go? What's your way of navigating a State Department of Health information?
So it's mostly contacts at the Oklahoma State Department of Health. So state by state, there are different rules and different levels of activity that it kind of parallels like Medicare, Medicaid expansion. So the states who have or have not done that, there's kind of a parallel with the State Department of Health and what they do there. It is very different from one state to the next. And the most useful thing to me. So they have to put certain information on all their websites. So that will be a common, but you're doing business and you're working in a state, you need to know those folks. You need to be involved with the things they're involved in so that when the department projects come up, they'll think about you and your organization. I get emails from our department of, hey, we've got this going on, or so I saw this opportunity and thought of you guys, you should have a look at this. So developing
So
those.
connection, so really developing relationships with the State Department of Health.
Yeah, the State Department
Yeah.
of Health, and it's not on the list here, but most states have a State Office of Rural Health Policy. So if you're a rural applicant, it's the same there. You need to develop those relationships and be in contact with those folks because they may be notified of funding opportunities and programs before anyone else. The federal grants are a process that involves folks in the government and politicians. So when that's voted on, the politician's going to email who they can think of back home, usually the State Office of Rural Health, that we've got this program going and it fits our rural thing, and I fought for it because you elected me and sent me to Washington. Office for Advancement of Telehealth and Professional Organizations. What was it that I saw just the other day? Was it the USDA, the new USDA program? The first place I saw it, I think, was the Office of Advancement of Telehealth, because they have their eye out and they're sharing that info. Then the professional organizations like Alliances for Telehealth, HIMSS is good. Other professional orgs, even on the clinical side. Sometimes, I mean, it's few and far between because we're always looking, but sometimes I will be caught by a doctor or nurse about a funding opportunity that I wasn't aware of because they're coming from different space.
Good list.
So the telehealth tips, search words, and this goes for grant.gov, Candid, Google, all of the aggregated sites. You may think that telemedicine is what I need to do, or I know that I want to be funded by HRSA or FCC, but you should really go through with a range of words meaning the same thing, or cast a wider net. It may cause a little bit of sifting, but you don't want to miss an opportunity that perfectly matches because they called it virtual care, mobile health versus remote patient monitoring, or the little terminology differences.
Would you also include digital health in that? I saw it's not listed, but maybe it's just been an oversight. Not sure.
Yeah, I think digital health, and we could probably brainstorm up a half a dozen other terms.
Good point. Yep.
It's important to know your funder. That kind of looks like it's a common theme, tying back to what we've been talking about here. The relationships are very important. With a federal grant, the reviewers are going to be people like me or previous grantees. Cynthia, you have probably been a reviewer before, like I have. I know they reach out if you've received grants from them. So the relationships with the folks in the granting agency is important because you can understand what they're looking for next. If you're in their trainings and sessions, you can maybe understand that they're not ready to send out a boatload of carts because they're interested in funding telebehavioral health this year or low-cost hardware solutions. That goes to past funding, but knowing your funder and having that relationship is important for having an idea of what's next and what's going to be a well-received application. That relationship doesn't have to be because you're the world's biggest expert and the university provost who takes care of all of these things. Most of the time, especially with grantees, it comes from asking questions, asking for help, even on the basic level, because like Cynthia described, the instructions are better for 424, but when I'm doing a 424 for a project, I really need to see a similar one, and I need to understand how all those things go and what different agencies expect and what their rules are on different amounts and different categories and how the money can be spent. So if you reach out to your project officer, your granting agency in the beginning with those specific questions, you can put it out there. I've done the homework, but for this particular program and your funding agency, exactly how does this go? And a lot of times they appreciate the thought and effort that you're putting in, even if it would be a dumb question to somebody else running the grant.
Yeah, one of the things that you point out in this, graphic and in your conversation is the very nuanced changes that you need to think about, just these small little pieces, and you catch those when you're talking to the funder. That you'll find out that matters to them, that, that there's 2 inches on each side of the border, those types of things. So that those details are important.
I like the graphic because I think the last RFP I was looking at, they have the 2 inches on each side.
Yeah.
They're going to tell you what font, what size, what spacing, and margins all the way around. They get down to that much. So yeah, I think that's a good graphic.
And you can be thrown out just for not following those directions. So that's important.
Absolutely. So resources for help and assistance, USDA rural utilities, distance learning, FCC, rural healthcare, HRSA, FCC RHC program is, I think they're in process now. We were working on some of that yesterday, and it's a good and helpful project. And earlier we were talking about the subscriptions and the other fees and the added expenses. FCC and even USDA in some cases, they're a great resource for those deeper infrastructure and usually very expensive things. The Rural Healthcare Connect program can do all sorts of things that most folks don't. It just requires a little planning. You maybe need to be a year out in advance, but if you have facilities that are struggling with bandwidth issues, you can even lease unlit fiber, and they will provide subsidy to help you with the infrastructure and even labor and installation to get those kind of things going. So they're a great and underused resource. We put in a lot of work with a great team to try and take advantage of that every year. And even for my organization, FCC's Rural Healthcare Connect is underused. Then HRSA, we've mentioned HRSA several times.
Josh.
And sorry.
No,
that's
my
fine.
fault.
That's fine. We reference HRSA a lot. I was just going to call back to that. I know Cynthia and I have both worked with them, and my most recent HRSA project that ended in 2020 is what I'm drawing a lot of this from. Granting agencies like those, they not only give out grants, but when they're going to do a large grant program, they'll also hire at great expense a very talented technical assistance provider, usually from universities or someone who's expert in the area. So that's also a great resource that comes with your grant, their contracted TA provider. I'll stop rambling now.
No, you're fine. I think it's important to know what you say here in bullet number 2, which is that the FCC is a subsidy and not a grant. I know that we've talked to a lot of folks about that as well. And so this means that your organization has to be able to put forward that funding beforehand and just essentially get reimbursed for those funds afterwards. So another consideration.
And another thing about FCC funding is it's generally in percentage. So they're going to award that. You may have to draw it down or be reimbursed, but in a lot of instances, they want to pay the vendor directly. And when they pay the vendor, you need to be ready to kick in your percentage. I have never been on the end where we could not pay our percentage, but I suspect that would be a mess.
I'm sure that would be a mess, but think you're right.
So I'm going to have to kind of move forward fairly quickly because we're about out of time, but now the RFP is out. We've talked a lot about the pre-work. Now is the, now we're down to the wire. So next. So again, it's a very short time frame. Check and recheck the requirements. I don't care what they did last year. They may change with their funding this year. They may change the requirements. Always check and recheck. And then make sure that your grant application meets with their requirements. Again, if they're not funding remote patient monitoring equipment, don't ask for it because you're just going to frustrate yourself and them. And make sure that you have a schedule. Again, as I mentioned, you have a very short time frame. Make a schedule with activities, what needs to be done at each point, and then stick to that schedule. Have someone that's really willing to keep that project going. Next. And then assume the reviewer doesn't know anything out about your organization or telehealth. There's always webinars or usually webinars from the federal funders. Listen to them, attend them, because that's one thing I picked up recently. They said, we have no clue about your organization. We really don't know much about telehealth. Describe, discuss, so that we have, whoever the reviewers are, have a really good feel for it. And again, I can't emphasize enough, get those letters early, the memorandum of agreement, even if it is just, okay, this clinic will participate if you get funded and we will pay our 15%, or we will agree to supply data. A lot of times I'm seeing on the funding now, they want the letters to include that component because they may say, we'll kick in the money, but nothing was said about data. What do you mean data? Is this PHI? I'm not about to do that. Well, no, you need to outline exactly what they are going to be expected to submit. And it's usually consolidated information.
I think it's important. One thing I was going to say about this, you mentioned that they don't know anything about your organization. Also, I know we've talked about this before, not to require them to hunt and peck for information. So if it's in another place, don't say see above or whatever, right? Because they're usually splitting this up between people.
That's a good point. I've seen that where you may put the same information in a couple places, but do it. Whatever they say to do, they're the ones with the purse strings. You want to do what they say and follow those instructions. Next. And then make sure that items are identified and priced separately and the way they want it to be priced. Sometimes they say, just tell us it's a telehealth cart and what all is included on it. Sometimes they want to know camera, monitor, battery pack. It just depends on the funder what they're wanting information on. Now, here's a tip. The vendor that you're getting this information from are the ones that are going to get some money out of this if you're funded. So it saves you time and there's less chance of misunderstanding if you have the vendor divided up exactly the way, and it's usually by site, exactly the way that the funder wants it. And that can be a good time saving tip. Again, allow the vendor some time to do that, because it does take time to separate things out like that, but that's a kind of a tip. Next.
Almost time to go. So this slide, I think, is meant to capture after all of that work and you're ready to submit. So you put in that 100 hours and you've gathered all the signatures. You've made sure you've timed board meetings so you could have the approvals and signatures you need and have all that work in. So now you don't want to send a product with a typo or a bad reference. So you need to stop, redo. I guess probably like being an author, you need to have an editor too. You need to make sure that everything is required, that's required is included. point by point with a checklist, maybe with a helper for that, then typos and grammar. You need a person that checks for that and a different for contact. And if you have more people or more help, the more the merrier there. Technology happens. That is a very great point. It doesn't happen to me anymore because I've run into it enough, but at 11 p.m. The night that the grant is due, so almost everyone has underestimated the amount of work or the time or the signatures that will be required. So that site, the government website with uploads, or the place that your documents are going, is going to be overwhelmed and not working well at the deadline. At least the day early is great, and that's a goal we all have. Sometimes it's the day of, but once it gets late that evening, if you're down to the last 10 minutes, you're probably out of luck on that, because a lot of people are overtaxing those systems then.
Yay, you've been awarded the grant. You've made the journey safely and successfully. Now, after everybody throws confetti and says, Yahoo, what happens? Well, first of all, be sure to read and understand what the notice of agreement that you're given. See what you're required to do. This is a contract. As we said, it's not winning the lottery. They just give you the money. This is a contract saying, we will use the funds in this way, and we will submit data and reports in a timely fashion and so forth. It's amazing to me how many representatives of, when I had a grant, they said, you're one of the unusual ones. You actually are doing what you said you're going to do. So, but then if you want funded again, they'll remember that. Trust me, you need to make sure you're doing it and in a timely fashion. Do understand the Office of Management and Budget governing circulars that they have before you spend the money or obligate the grant funds. Again, this is, yay, we've got the money, but then make double sure everything is what you need. And again, schedule what you're going to do in what order. Hopefully you already had a project schedule in your work plan, in your proposal, but now's the time to kick in when it's going to happen. Sometimes people have things like month 1, month 2. Well, now you need to put dates on those so that people don't lose sight of what is due and when. And document your progress, because then when you have to do those reports, you don't have to say, now, what did we do last May? I know we did something. So always document so that when you have to make those reports, it's easy just to grab that information. Next. And finally, as Josh noted, they usually have contracted technical assistants. Oh, use them, become their best friend, because they are a wealth of help and information. And that kind of brings us to a close. Do we have any questions?
So that, first of all, let me just say that was super, super helpful. I love these pictures. And I know people should know that, Josh, you actually took this picture along with the picture that was of the Grand Canyon because of your recent trip to Las Vegas for HIMSS. So thank you for your wonderful photography, for starters.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, those were, well, except Wally World, those were from my camera roll on the cell phone.
So Josh has got some great vacation shots. So I think that what was great to hear in this presentation is all of the little insights that you learn along the way when you've done these grants over the years. It's really easy to sort of become punch drunk with grant money, right? That you think I've got $100,000, I've got a $2 million grant that I can go for, and I'm a rural academic facility and I can, run after that. So I think those were really great professional tips. Didn't expect anything less, but you all did a great job. Amanda, I know you've been monitoring the chat. think I can select it. I know that we did have the 2 links into the system, onto the chat for the 2 USDA grants that came out. So you can take a look at those, track 1 and track 2, that are listed there in the chat. And I think someone was saying they like free in the comments. So there's a few free resources that we talked about. And also we noted where your TRC resource is. So you can look at where you are from a location, from a regional perspective. And then folks have asked if this is going to be recorded, and it is being recorded. So it will be posted onto our website along with all of our other webinars that we typically do. They are posted on our website, as well as our radio show that we do every month as well. And last month we interviewed Dr. Megan Ranney, for example, as well as Ann Mont Johnson, the CEO of ATA. So, and Laura Massino, the Vice President of Virtual Care for Highmark. So we have some great radio show guests that we interview. We have some great webinars that we do. And I think from a question perspective, we answered them along the way. And you can find our webinar information once they're posted and recorded. They will be in the Knowledge Tsunami section. How many grants do you figure that the 2 of you, Josh and Cynthia, that you've worked on? And when you think about the percentage of success rate, so you've written this many grants, you received this many, what do you think that looks like? Have you thought about that at all?
I'd say about, well, it just depends. That's part of the selection process is that you want to select ones that you have a good chance of getting. But even then, I just wrote a grant, very high marks, but it wasn't quite high enough because they had such few grantees that they awarded. So I'm sort of, I would
That's
say
a tough one,
probably
right? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I would probably, I'm about a 70% success.
Yeah, and we've got some talented grant folks that we work with, so I keep up with their percentages. Not mine as much. So 70-80% is really exceptional. The things that have been 100% on me, I'm probably closer to 50-50, which is still a lot. I would say, maybe industry average is 10 or 20, probably.
So this is good expectation setting, right? Don't think the first grant you're going to write that you're going to 100% win that. So Josh, Cynthia, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience today. Thank you everyone who has been able to join us today for being on the webinar. We will do another webinar in September. As always, if you have topics that you want us to cover, please send this to us. We are always looking for different topics that our listeners want to hear about. We're happy to cover those. All of our webinars are free and they're all posted on our website. Thank you to both of you. Have a good day.
Thanks.